Toxic masculinity, violence against women, a crisis of masculinity, the rise of the Sigma male. These topics are regularly in our news feeds, but perhaps tragically, not a common topic of discussion in our churches. What is masculinity? Is it in crisis? What does Scripture have to say about it? And what role does the church have to play in helping our young men define a healthy masculinity? I'm Melanie Cave, Managing Director at Roots, and today I'm talking to Will van der Hart. Will's an author, communicator and pastoral specialist. He's an ordained Anglican priest based in London and the director of mental health charity Mind and Soul Foundation, and he's an executive coach. Will regularly speaks on emotions and mental health, but this topic of masculinity has become an area of interest and study in the last few years. Together we open up the topic and try to grasp hold of this slippery issue. We confess this may raise more questions than answers and send you off on your own quest for understanding. So this is not a neat explanation, but avoiding the topic has done nothing to help young men in our society, and it certainly hasn't curbed the rising tide of misogyny and violence against women and girls. A trigger warning, we do mention pornography, sexual violence, violence against women and girls, abuse, and although there are no explicit details or personal stories, this is probably not suitable for very young audiences. Hello, Will. Great to have you on the Roots for Churches.
Well, thank you so much. We've been waiting a little while, haven't we, for this? It's been a while, but I think really important conversation.
Yeah, much anticipated. So we're going to talk about masculinity, and I just want to start by saying, what drew your interest to this topic? What heightened this in your mind?
I mean, I've got 3 children. I've got a daughter and 2 sons. And I think it's my daughter, really, who was raising some concerns about some of the things that were being said by some of the boys in her year. She's just 16, reference to a few of the people we might talk about a bit today. But I think it was quite frightening to me to sense that the world, which I believed we'd maybe left behind a little bit, was somehow resurgent, and that the young men were using very negative stereotypes around masculinity, around what makes masculinity, what makes them masculine, other types of masculinity that they thought was suboptimal, some of the material that they're engaging with online. And I was really uncomfortable just thinking about the world my daughter is growing up in. And I think that really prompted me. I spend a lot of time coaching and counselling men particularly, and I deal with lots and lots of issues that men bring to the table. And I hadn't come across sort of extreme misogyny amongst any of my clients who tend to be 40 to 70-year-olds who would have left that world behind them in their estimation. So I think the idea that somehow some of these ideas were becoming resurgent in society was very, very troubling. So I think there's a level of kind of self-protection here, because I want to look after my daughter and I want her to grow up in a world which is supportive of her as a woman, but also some of it's asking bigger questions about what it means as a church leader to coach men into healthy masculinity. And that's also been unbelievably hard to kind of crystallize. And I've done a few seminars at different Christian events, trying to gather men. I've tried to work with a few other men. Sometimes we end up just recycling some of the old tropes about masculinity as well, which is less than satisfactory. So I'm in a really curious space for this. I apologize if this podcast doesn't kind of bring a sort of strong manifesto. I'm very much in the explorative space with this stuff, but I feel like it's a conversation we need to start having.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of issues. One, it's a huge issue. Yeah. And to try and define masculinity over 51% of the population or whatever it is, that's a very wide demographic to try to narrow down to a few sentences to describe this. I think the other issue is that it's quite hard to get a handle on. It's got its fingers into all these different spheres. I think we notice what we don't like. We spot stuff and we go, "Ooh, that's bad." But we find a hard time labeling what is good, I think. We know violence against women and girls is on the rise. So statistically, 1 in 4 women in the UK experience domestic violence. Violence against women and girls accounts for 20% of all police recorded crimes. And the one that scared me the most, There's been a 37% increase in violent crimes against women and girls between 2018 and 2023. Like, that's so current. That, like, 37, what is happening? And as you say, like, you look around your world, and maybe this is the place of privilege and white middle class, but like, we look around the world and we don't see this on the surface. But obviously underneath the surface, and obviously not very deep, is this surge of violence and a very different way of viewing women and girls. And it could be coming from social media. It could be coming from lots of places. I mean, there's models in leadership now, perhaps in the United States, that is much more aggressive, perhaps a model of masculine leadership that, as you say, perhaps we thought we moved on from, but now we're back in it fully. It's hard to understand how our culture got here. But I guess perhaps the place to start is, can we define some terms? Like, what do we mean by masculinity? What is this word?
Yeah.
I mean, like,
it really is. I mean, I find it really interesting that we've gone from an introduction to masculinity straight into statistics about violence against women and girls. And the question is, can we have a conversation about masculinity that doesn't react immediately, against itself, to point out that reality? And so we can't. And that's that, in a way, the fact that we cannot have a conversation about masculinity that doesn't talk about sexual assault, violence, rape, domestic abuse, coercive controlling behavior, is a sign that we are in a really bad place where masculinity is concerned. And it's acknowledging that it's not just, it's a conversation that's being had across the genders. The women are having a conversation about what's happening amongst men, that these statistics are evident today. And it's a question that men are having in, I hope, horror, to also ask the same question about their own gender and say, well, what is it about masculinity today which is leading this resurgence in domestic violence? And I think, it's a great sadness to me that a conversation cannot be had around masculinity that doesn't begin with domestic violence or abuse. I think about a conversation we might have about what femininity means, and I cannot imagine a conversation about femininity which would begin with a discussion around violence against men.
Yeah, it's just not statistically as...
No, exactly. Yeah. So I think I just to kind of highlight that the position that we're in is that this situation is not, it's not a sort of benign conversation. It's loaded, So the impact on young women, read this, that 41% of UK girls aged 14 to 17 in an intimate relationship experience some form of sexual violence from their partner. And that's from Refuge. Now, just to think about that for a moment, we're talking about 14 to 17-year-olds. So these are really children. 41% of these young girls experience some form of sexual violence. Now, I would say we cannot have a conversation around masculinity without having a conversation about masculine sexuality, particularly the use of pornography. And in my view, successive governments have overlooked the digital risks facing men and boys associated with the exposure to inappropriate, violent, degrading and misogynistic online content. I think David Cameron was given the option, if you remember, in a bill in Parliament, to ensure that all computer providers and television providers that installed online access to online content that was pornographic would have an opt-in button versus an opt-out button. And he decided actually instead to go for the opt-out version. So every device effectively could enable you to access hardcore online content without control. And I wonder whether, we talk about free speech and liberty, but our ambition to create personal choice has moved to such an extreme level that our personal choice to engage with extreme content online has a absolutely dynamic and direct impact on the well-being of 14 to 17-year-old young women.
Yeah. Well, all of that content is creating sexual scripts, it's creating norms, and we as adults can go, oh, that's extremism, that's not a norm. But as children, if they don't have that filter, how do they know that that's not normal? Obviously, 42% of these boys think it is normal.
But let's also acknowledge the fact that pornography isn't normal. So we can talk about normality, we can talk about legality, But actually, normality is a different conversation.
Health is a whole different conversation
right,
as well. What
absolutely.
does healthy relationship looks like?
People thought smoking was healthy in the 1920s. Now they realise it's the cause of 2 out of 3 cancer deaths, associated with smoking. What I find, in a way, that there's a clash of worlds at the moment, and a grave concern I have when we think about healthy masculinity is within the context of the church is the discipleship agenda, the willingness for us to say in leadership, this is wrong, and we should not live this way, is not a conversation I'm hearing. Mm. What I'm hearing is a lot of personal discipleship, the discernment of right and wrong. So I think, when we think about this idea of sort of directives, again, we could use a gender stereotype here against men potentially, but say men tend to enjoy really defined regulation. So they enjoy sports with clear rules. Yeah. They enjoy social relationships which are clearly defined. They enjoy the idea that there is a way of doing, and this is the way we all do, and it's a level playing field. They tend not to enjoy nuance particularly. And again, we have this conversation where consent's concerned, that men are in the grey, and actually we're saying no, like no is no, and all these different sort of this sense of clear regulation. Within the context of the church, men's ministries tend to have vanished. There are very few men's ministries anymore which are directly challenging male behaviour. For example, the use of pornography. In the sort of the turn of the noughties, I was constantly being engaged by leaders who were thinking about doing programs like XXX Church or Covenant Eyes, and there was always literature around to encourage men to desist from using pornography. Those ministries are pretty much vaporized, and I no longer hear the sort of struggle that I used to hear from Christian men who were wanting to be accountable to one another to stop using pornography online, for example. Now, I think, again, we've become so culturally permissive, there's almost now perceived to be normative for men to be using pornography online. The question is, what sort of pornography? And then it comes about a grade of like, oh, is it okay, or is it violent or misogynistic? Well, I've got a 14-year-old son, desperately trying to keep him from accessing bad material online. But, as a child, and he's amongst children. Now, how they share content and how they engage with content, have the maturity to know that isn't okay and how to step away from that. That's something that you need to be educated in. We could talk about the sort of meta story of masculinity, but I, in a way, want to talk about the micro story of parenting. Because, we're talking here about a generation of men who have grown up in a, I'd say a directively absent culture, where I use these terms very generally, and I know there'll be parents on here who say, well, I'm not absent, and I haven't been absent with my sons. But the statistics that we're facing today demonstrate that a lot of our young boys who've now become men haven't been parented in a directive way, where something is okay or not okay. These are some of the rules that we live by, partly because the idea that rules are wrong. The idea that actually we all need to find our own path, and actually everything is available to us and we just have to make a good choice. Well, that flies in the face of all of the psychology around addiction that says, you can socially imprint, you can create desires that aren't natural, you can kind of distort the narrative, you can create the new normal, and you can desire that thing if you've created it. And so there's some real foundational issues that we're facing where discipleship and parenting are concerned. And, if there was something which I think the church could do, it's about bringing in, without embarrassment, some of these core challenges. Sometimes I wonder, I think the loose stats were something like 53% of adult men use pornography regularly. If actually we're not talking about pornography, because a lot of the people who are in leadership, or the people who might be kind of those trying to hold other people to account, are themselves struggling. But again, that requires another conversation about the fact that actually addictions require accountability and commitment. And these things, they're there, and we have to begin to deal with them.
Yeah,
So I've gone off on a.
No, no, it's good. The chemicals in your brain that get stimulated, it becomes a chemical addiction in your brain, even though you're not taking a substance in. Particularly with sexual addictions, that it really is an addiction. And if you don't treat it like an addiction, if you just treat it like, well, I must stop lying, or some other sort of sense, it's a different sort of habit to break.
Yeah. I mean, I hear us referencing in churches, and I'm a wellbeing chaplain to 184 churches, so I see a lot of what's going on. I hear a lot of reference to substance abuse. You know, are you addicted to alcohol? Are you addicted to drugs? We've got a great rehabilitation program, or there's a great ministry associated here. I do not hear people saying we have an accountability group for men who are struggling with pornography addiction, or, you know, we have an addictions clinic here, or we encourage people to address this issue. Again, it's like, I feel like the narrative we've become permissive around issues which are defining the conversation around masculinity. And then I look at these statistics and I'm thinking, how are we at that point where sexual violence has become normalized around, you know, over a third of young men who are sexually active under the age of 18? That can only be because they've had that modeled, and they've become, you know, in a way, they've become desensitized to themselves, to violence. I mean, so I don't get stuck on that, but I guess my sorrow is that we cannot have a conversation around masculinity without also having a conversation around violence and abuse.
Yeah.
That said, there is another part of this conversation, which is that men, this is a very difficult conversation to have because I can immediately hear people listening to this conversation. Many men, rightly or wrongly, and I think a lot of people would say wrongly, feel that society has de-centered them over the last 20 years. And I think what I've not, and I've tried to kind of engage with some of the online conversations around this, what tends to happen is you have the sort of some of the Joe Rogan, can I use that term, style podcasts, which bring on articulate men who want to create a case whereby they believe that the world has been over-feminized at the expense of men. Now, a lot of these podcasts are creating a narrative which is false. It's overblown. But what they are picking up on is a group of men, you know, and boys in maybe the US and the UK who aren't doing well. And if you then create a manifesto around them not doing well and create an enemy to them not doing well, then you can create a movement. And the terror that we're now facing is a counter swing of really 50 years of inequalities movement, which is only really saw any realization, I'd say, in the 2010s, where you could start seeing the changes at the top of business, seeing female CEOs, seeing a change in the workplace, seeing women begin to achieve really well professionally, and seeing girls' attainment really rise up significantly in schools. So you have this sort of pinnacle moment, but this counter response is propagating a lot of misogynist ideas again. And the issue is not, this is not a justification, but the counter response from some women publicly has been quite a lot of eye rolling and going, oh, boo-hoo, poor men. You know, they've had 2,000 years of patriarchal dominance, and now they're complaining that things are a bit more equal. Now, of course, I would share that sentiment. It's like, as we look at the situation from kind of sky level and go, there's a rebalancing here that makes sense. As people personally feel discriminated against, they don't hold that in the context of a generational or demographically held discrimination. It's just,
they just feel it.
They feel it, right? Exactly. So there is an issue, but it's not a woman's issue to solve, but it's a societal issue around men. And what I don't want to do is just say, well, everything we've said so far is that men are largely responsible for gender-related violence. They are largely responsible for all the sexual violence and assault we described. They're largely the dominant group in terms of consuming violent and degrading pornography online. All of that is true. We could say, well, that is the reason, therefore, we have this problem. There is another problem, and that is men and boys aren't doing well. and hopelessness propagates a rearming, if you like, which is I'm going to take back ground and opportunity. And I point to this amazing report, which I recommend everyone listen to, by the CSJ, which was this Centre for Social Justice report called Lost Boys. And what I really noticed was that young men in the UK, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, were in a sort of crisis. And this is really a hidden crisis in society because it's not socially a particularly popular thing to define. You know, it doesn't fit with the narrative of saying, oh, well, actually, boys and men aren't doing very well, so we need to give them some extra support. It doesn't fit with everything that we've been describing. And also, it doesn't sit comfortably when you think about everything we began the podcast by describing. It's like, well, should we now reward those people who might be responsible for those things which we find most abhorrent in society? But some of these issues are really interesting. Educational underachievement. Boys constantly now lag behind girls. By the end of primary school, 75% of girls achieve better outcomes, than 60% of boys the same. And that gap persists for GCSE and A-level. Fewer boys now progress to university than they used to. In employment, obviously, all of the typical male-dominated industries, manufacturing and construction, have seen, a reduction in employment opportunities for young men. And now males 14 to 24 not in education has increased by 40%, when it's only increased by 7% amongst females. So there's some huge, lag there. And then we've got, say, social and societal perceptions of masculinity. This is the key point, really, is that men aren't doing well. And then there's this sentiment that traditional masculine values are undervalued. Now, like the mystery of our conversation, Mel, is that what is that? What is that? But this feeling that I'm now undervalued, or the traits that make me male aren't valued, or that they don't exist, or that they've been hijacked by a different demography. And that is what's so hard. And I would say, I've tried hard to ask the question, what is masculinity? And I really struggle to offer an answer that I feel comfortable with. Do you want to, I don't go there?
Yeah, well, I think, because I think it's worth voicing the discomfort, because I think other people will resonate this. Because equally, if I start with femininity, for example, like, what is femininity? I come up with words like beauty, gentleness, nurture, holding a family together, creating life. There's something sometimes about being receptive, but equally, as a woman, I know that I can be feisty, I can be strong, come after my kids and I turn into Mama Bear, I can be a warrior. So I've got a friend who's, a Paralympian, awesome, strong woman. So the things that historically sort of we differentiated in this whole deconstruction, which probably has been going on for 70 years, in feminism, we've said, hey, wait a minute, men can't have strength because we want to be strong too. We can be protectors as much as them. We can lead. So if we make all of that just what it means to be humanity, well, these are just qualities of being a good human.
Absolutely.
We should all be protective. We should all be strong. We should all be receptive. We should all be gracious and gentle and create life. But when I do that, I can see that deconstruction gives me all the pieces and doesn't leave very many for men. I'm like, I want them all, but I also want you to be strong and protect me too. How can men lay down all of that honor and respect and still step into it? And I was in an interesting intercultural conversation the other night, and we were talking about the difference between guilt and innocence cultures, honor shame cultures, and fear power cultures. And I wonder if this masculinity thing is actually about honor shame. And they talked about, in honor cultures, there's a fixed amount of honor. So if I give you honor, I'm kind of losing some myself. And if you do something to lose honor, you might want to win it back. And they're reflecting on how a lot of the New Testament is Jesus grappling in this honor shame, the Pharisees feeling very threatened. So a lot of his interactions are about honor shame. And I look at this sort of masculinity thing and think, it feels like there's a finite amount of respect or honor out there, and that men have been feeling like women are taking that honor or disrespecting them. And so the comeback is to push back really violently and violently take that honor, respect, control sometimes back. And so how can we, I mean, maybe the question is there a limited amount of honor? Can we all have some? Maybe that needs deconstructing. But I do think there's something about men wanting honor, respect, to be valuable, to be, and so something about masculinity is ways that men can gain honor and respect in society. I don't know if that starts to 10.
Yeah, no, look, I think I love what you just said, and I think it's really, really helpful, because one way in which I've come into this conversation, and I wouldn't say I'm not an expert. Mental and emotional health is my thing, but like this, this feels like a bit of a side foray for me, and that's probably I hope people forgive me for being terribly unarticulate today on the subject, but I'm really wrestling with it, and so I think what I've experienced and what I've tried to engage with this is this idea that there are not finite there's not a finite pool of traits out there. Like there isn't a finite pool of honor. And actually the idea that I take traits and therefore I take them away from you is hugely problematic. When we think about hegemonic masculinity, which is this idea of normally white male social dominance and the strength definition being the kind of key one, it felt like there were throughout, particularly if you take the sort of 100 years since Truman's strongman speech, there's been this idea that women fit a particular, feminine but hegemonically defined position in society, which is, maternalized and very much kind of the kindness, care, compassion, nurture narrative. And men take the courageous, strong, dominant, powerful narrative. And those traits can only belong exclusively to one group or another. That is so problematic. And that's what we're seeing in a way come back, is hegemonic masculinity, which is men having this idea that they can only be defined by those traditional hegemonic traits. Now, I think masculinity cannot be defined by a fixed group of hegemonic traits. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And it actually diminishes. I'm hugely emotive. I'm definitely a lover, not a fighter. I wouldn't describe myself as, as a predominantly strong. I'd say I'm predominantly soft. But I think that's a gift, right? So when we think about distribution of traits, when you were describing femininity, I was thinking, hold on a minute, that's describing some of me. But I can hold that within a masculine frame. So the trait doesn't define me as either masculine or feminine. I'm defined in my masculinity by God. Like my sex is defined by God, but how I express my sex in definition is almost like a lens through which all of those traits of humanity which God has given us are reflected. So if I take the virtue of strength and I wear it within my male sex, I wear it through a lens which makes it masculine. Whereas if you take a gift of strength and wear it in your female sex, you wear it as a feminine trait. Now, that doesn't mean that we can define strength and say, well, that's a sort of female sort of strength, and that's not as strong as a male sort of strength. I'd say it's equal. Maybe you could say it's equally strong, but it just looks slightly different. And the nuance of that is so fine that it's not surprising that people want to take a much more visceral set of traits and go, really being male and strong is about having big muscles and, and being very dominant. That's what's difficult. It feels like this is my maleness is a lens through which you can see God-given traits in me, which you could see in my wife in a slightly different light through the lens of her femaleness. But my conclusion, and again, it's a weak conclusion, it's my conclusion, it's not like a definitive conclusion, was to be that the lens through which God has created me, a masculine lens in the shape of Will van der Hart, is the way in which you can then see these traits demonstrated, and that's actually what you describe as my character. And everyone's got a unique character, and some of those characters are expressed in a masculine lens and some in a feminine lens, but they carry all the same virtue and value, but they shine in a slightly different light. Now, trying to sell that to Andrew Tate and his friends, I don't think that's gonna go down particularly well. But it feels like there is almost a war emerging on these virtues and traits, and there are men who are this ISIL, this idea of like ultra masculinity. You mentioned America. I think it's been the case over the last 70 years that what happens in America tends to bleed over to the UK over the course of 2 or 3 years. I think with the internet and with exposure to American media, that probably has accelerated hugely. But we have a president in America who has been accused of, and in a court of law, I think, given reprimand to sexual assault. There's a reality. And we are in a world where there are an awful lot of men and older men who align to that, whatever that says. What does that say?
Well, it says it's permitted. It doesn't say that leaders are held to a higher account. It says we respect strong leadership, and with strong leadership, we'll turn a blind eye to these sort of behaviours because we respect your strength. But some people would describe those behaviours as bullying, much worse, especially the cases of sexual violence. And so it sort of says, well, this is what strength looks like. It looks like a bully. It looks like someone who takes. And I think, unfortunately, if that is held up as a person high in authority and leadership, what does that say? It sort of is sanctioning. And I know there's lots of anxiety in the UK church of how do we respond to this very different form of leadership that's coming out of the US? How do we set ourselves apart? Is this the new form of leadership? And high levels of anxiety around that, and not knowing quite how to respond. I think all of this comes to this. We've deconstructed what masculinity is, and the thing we're trying to replace it with is still quite nebulous or still quite nuanced. And as you say, like, men want something more structured. I think it's also a developmental thing. I think teenagers, whether male or female, they like things to be black and white and concrete. I've had conversations with my son about this of like, I just want you to tell me how it is. I'm like, well, the problem is there's about 10 factors here and you have to hold them in balance. And he's just like, I just want, what's the right answer? But I think that is a developmental stage. When you get into your 40s and 50s, you're happier with a more nuanced answer. You want that because you know there's shades of grey, but that doesn't help a teenager trying to form their identity. And at that sort of stage of life, being masculine and fitting in and having that street cred or the respect or the body that looks the way masculine bodies are supposed to look, that's so important. Yeah. And we're trying to give them this, here I am in my 40s, answer to it. And it's just not working.
Yeah. No, it's not working. But the challenge is then, and I have 2 young boys and, we do, we are they're great sportsmen and into all that stuff. I am not talking to them about, a nuanced masculine frame through which we view all the different traits. But I'm equally not telling them that men are like this and women are like that. I think what I believe is that we need dads to be dads to their boys. And we have a crisis of broken families in the UK. We have a crisis of masculine absenteeism from their families. There is a critique that many of our churches don't promote or support men in children's ministry. The vast majority of our children's helpers are women, and I think we need men to step up into that space. There is a lot of concern amongst men that if I do, I'm showing an odd interest in younger children, and that would
the fear of paedophilia,
put me under scrutiny. And so we have to address that head on and say, hold on a minute, we need our young children to see male role models who are invested in faith. A lot of our churches don't support or seem to demonstrate things that we might, in a stereotypical world, put in a masculine box. There's lots of singing, lots of loving one another. Jesus looks like he's had a lovely perm recently, and it's sort of,
and he's in a dress. Let's be honest,
actually dressed. So the idea of sort of, a stronger, rough fisherman sort of style carpenter like Jesus that might appeal to a traditionally masculine demographic is often absent. We know that role modeling, and we know that mentoring, and we know that male proximity is crucial to developing healthy relationships, healthy self-constructs, and also healthy respect. I think children learn most through how their parents interact. If dads are not honouring of their wives in the home, if they're bullying or misogynistic or sexually demanding, that all filters through to the expectations of young men who are seeing that behaviour modelled. But if men are honouring, and if they demonstrate those traits we described as gentle and kind and nurturing and supportive, they receive that identity as normative. And the person who's their biggest early years hero, their dad, is the person who's taught them those things that matter most. And the terrifying thing about everything we're saying today is what we're seeing now are young men schooled who are going to be the parents of the next generation. And what are the young men of those young men going to see in their homes that they're then going to emulate in our society? And that is a terrifying thought, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Wow. But, no man, woman likes to be called toxic. You're lost, confused, you've been deconstructed. We do want good men.
Yeah.
And we want good women as well. We want good humans. And I think there is a fear in the church to get involved and to speak out on these issues. So there's huge levels of controversy around transgender, sexual orientation, homosexuality. All of that conversation is highly emotive and divisive. So churches just think, let's just not talk about that. Let's keep that one quiet. I think people are aware that there are different opinions about this within the church. And so to have as you say, sort of have a strong lead on this to say pornography is wrong, or you should treat people respectfully. I think people are worried of getting called out and get into some awkward situations and causing more division. I think there's probably also a thing if you've got women leaders in the church, do women want to be telling men how to be men? Should men be telling men how to be men? Just awkward interactions around that. And I just think the church kind of goes, this is complicated. Gosh, I don't know what to do. Let's not do anything.
Yeah. I mean, and even more than that, I'd say, Mel, recently I'm in the Diocese of London. I've been a priest here for 21 years. My Bishop Sarah Melanie, was recently at General Synod crying publicly over the experience that our female leaders are having, with regard to misogynistic, microaggressions from other male leaders. I mean, there's still a lot of leaders in our diocese who don't support the ministry of women, even though we have a female bishop. So my wife is also ordained and has also experienced some of this. And I work with a team of women in a mental health partnership at the moment who talk about, who ask the question, is the church itself a safe place for women? So when we think about, if you like, I don't nervously use the word corrective, but we think about a corrective in terms of saying, has the church become overly feminized, and do we want to create a corrective that supports a more masculine mentality that enables our young men and boys to have role models? We're saying that also in the face of an environment which is already deemed to me misogynistic and opposed to the leadership of women.
Yeah.
So are we overcorrecting the corrective? That's also a risk. So I think the article I wrote is wholly deficient. I think everything I've been saying over the last 40 minutes probably demonstrates.
We did give you a word count. This is a book and a half, isn't it?
Absolutely. There was a word count, which I'm good. Thank you that you helped me out of a hole there. That's really sweet of you.
No, it's a huge topic. And I think we scratch the surface, don't we?
Yeah, we do
and that's why we've got this conversation, because, and this conversation will spur others, will it not? Because you can't resolve this in 45 minutes,
But yeah, sure. But I mean, if we were gonna find any sort of grounds or any basis, I ultimately come back to faith, and I guess wanting to recover a biblical vision for masculinity and femininity is so important. I've done a lot of work. I did feminist Christology when I was at Cambridge as a specialist subject. I've always sort of sought to challenge the way in which the New Testament has been edited to retain a patriarchal mentality and subjugate women. And I find the true New Testament a wholly liberating manifesto for women. And I find Jesus' treatment of women absolutely radical in the first century. I don't think there's a sociologist out there who wouldn't historically attest to the impact that Jesus had on the place of women in society. That in itself feels like, apart from me believing Jesus is the Son of God, that for me is a testimony to why I would want to listen to the voice of Jesus on the topic of gender, because he was so radical. He offers equality in Ephesians, that passage that's often split in the printing to leave female subjugation in the second part when male and female equality has actually been offered. Just ordaining that women would be the first to meet the resurrected Lord, the first to the tomb, the last at the cross. I mean, we could go on and on for a whole nother podcast about why Jesus creates a radical case for equality of women. But he does that. He doesn't do that at the expense of men. He does that because he models what it looks like for both men and women to be made in the image of God in Genesis 1:27. And that idea that what we do unto others, we do unto the Lord, is one of the most fundamental principles on which I believe we need to have a conversation about maleness and femaleness, because ultimately it's one built on the fact that within one another we see the image of God, both masculine and feminine. And I think that conversation can be tilted towards God is male, and God's ordained men to be the leaders, and men should look like this and work like this. But actually God's enabled us to see, God within us, in our females and in our male bodies. And that is a remarkable truth. I think that recovering the language of that and of honouring one another and therefore honouring the Lord is so foundational to any conversation we have around this. I think challenging and rejecting toxic distortions has always been the work of the church. You think about the development of scriptures as a narrative in the 1st to 3rd century was largely around discounting all the different heresies that there were. You could say, how was the New Testament compiled? It was largely compiled by discounting heresies.
It's quite reactive, isn't it?
People think that you kind of stacked the books together, but actually what you did was a whole lot of books stacked together, and then they had to carve out what was really there. It was much more like a sculpture, that Michelangelo was releasing the sculpture from the rock. He wasn't putting the sculpture into the rock. And the New Testament was really compiled by releasing God's perfect truth out of the rock of all sorts of different heresies. And I think we as Christians have to be willing to challenge the toxicity directly, rather than saying, oh, well, that's your truth on masculinity and here's mine, sort of thing. Actually, we have to challenge and celebrate virtues, but recognize they can also be hugely distorted. Like, strength without justice is not strength, it's abuse.
Yeah.
Control without consciousness is just another form of abuse. If there's all good virtues can be distorted, into evil ones.
Onto an extreme. Yeah, when you take it without balance. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think there's I think we have a vocation in Christian leadership to challenge the toxic distortions without being terrified of there being a binary. I think Luther said, if it's not a paradox, it's probably not God. There are so many paradoxes in this conversation, and we have to live in tension, which, as you say, I understand and I agree, for our younger men, living in those paradoxes is very, very hard to do.
Yeah.
We can demonstrate sides of the equation well in mentoring, in role modeling, and in parenting. And as our children mature, we can show them more of the paradox. So I think we're called to reject distortions. In trying to find some ground on this, though, I think in the church, where can we land? That's
the big question.
What do we want to see and what we want to do? And I think, you're a brilliant, Mel, and just spending like an hour with you just talking about this stuff, I feel even more like passionate about the area, but also passionate about the conversation. And I think, and this isn't an easy, I do podcasts around emotional health. I feel like I can kind of swan in and I've done all my reading and I feel like very confident about what I'm saying. And I'd say I find this is really difficult. Like I'm working out what I'm saying, what I'm thinking, despite stewing on this for nearly a year. And I'm still finding it so difficult, but I just find it so helpful that we can have this conversation. And I think just, again, male and female, to have a conversation together about what this means. And surely one of the massive problems we're facing is that masculinity in this contemporary world and femininity are being defined aside from a cross-gender conversation. That actually, we talk about getting men together to talk about what it means to be a man. Well, we can't really do that without also having a conversation with women about what it means to them to engage with men. And we can't, in the feminine, for women to define what it means to be female, we need to also have the conversation about how they experience their femininity through the men that they interact with. And I think the church is a great place of reconciliation where those conversations can be had. And like you say, maybe we shy away from them because they are so complex. I mean, anyone who's listened to this conversation will be thinking, Flip, I'm glad I wasn't.
Yeah, well, you worry that you're putting something on the record or that, but it's that sense of like, you're not trying to offend, but you are trying to walk this path and land on something that gives life and that does give some like guardrails to stay within so that you have something to bounce against. Because when it's wide open and there's no lines anywhere, it's terrifying. And for our young people, it's very disorienting. And I think what we're seeing is in that space with no guide rails and no rules, no structure, they're turning to violence or they're turning to stuff that we know is wrong.
Yeah.
So if we don't nail some colours to the mast, if we just keep in wishy-washy land, it's not really working for us or for them.
No.
And
No,
so,
and,
the
and,
church
and if,
must have this conversation. And
sure.
one of my frustrations is, and this is here's someone who works within the Revised Common Lectionary, the preaching that we do, the Bible passages we look at every Sunday, those awkward passages that we talked about, 1 Corinthians 12 and 14, 1 Timothy 2, and Ephesians 5, they're not in the RCL. They never come up.
Wow.
So in a church that is like an Anglican or Methodist church that's preaching through it, you never have to preach on those awkward passages.
Yeah.
But those awkward passages are often the fuel or the passages that have shaped the church and culture's treatment of women. You know, women should be silent. The headship passages, women should submit to their husbands, and avoiding that mutual submission passage. Women are saved through childbirth. There's a great one in 1 Timothy. Have a go at that. And we just don't address them. So therefore, when people read them themselves, they go, oh, do I just skip that bit of the Bible? Or is the stuff I sort of picked up through the ether of childhood or a line in a book that they've read, that is shaping it more than sort of concrete teaching. And then that perpetuates this violence towards women, this attitudes of misogyny, because the church is not addressing it head on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and if we could advocate for more of those conversations and for more direct preaching from Scripture, I find some of those passages, I find them remarkable that they've stood for so long with the interpretation that's so often been given to them. When you look at them and place them within history, you realise exactly what they were intent to address. So I think absolutely fundamental to get to grips with that, and to get to grips with them from quite a young age. I think, again, we can spoon feed our younger people. It's great to tell them every week that Jesus loves them and teach them all the kind of core tenets of Christian faith. But actually, my sort of 14-year-old is in these conversations. And if we don't have these conversations, they're having these conversations with Andrew Tate and others. And the fact is, unless we show them leadership in this space around masculine and feminine identity, they will find it somewhere else. And there are very, very manipulative voices online which create movements distorting history to try and show and legitimize a kind of right way. Unfortunately, again, I think the CSJ article points out that young boys are much, much more likely to turn to right-wing politic, to extreme groups, to orientate themselves around very, very right-wing content, whereas young women tend to, according to their investigation, lean towards more liberal content online. And so if our young boys are already going there, they're going to go there to find the sort of stuff that legitimize the mentalities that they've got. And then we're going to see those supercharged in our society. So I think we would both love to see more of these conversations wrestled out in the public space.
Yeah. And I think, we often see in history, you get the pendulum swing of going to a more right-wing and then much more to a liberal left-wing side. And it swings, and people are sort of commenting now, oh gosh, we're seeing all this right-wing stuff happening in elections and across Europe, and a panic of why are our young people moving this way? And it can be in reaction to, I just want something to stand up for. I want something to hold on to. I want some guardrails. I want some definition here. And where we don't want to go to is sort of this horrific, violent, fascist sort of extreme. But if the church is not actually standing up and saying, here are some great things to base your life on, here's respect, here's honor, here's love, here's looking out for the marginalized, this is what it does mean to be masculine or feminine, this is how you can have healthy relationships. If we're not upfront and actually talking about those subjects, I think you're right, they want it, so they will find it where they can find it. And I'd much rather them find a healthy, Christ-centered version.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, if we could get our young men to stand up and fight for the oppressed in the way that they might want to stand up and fight for hegemonic masculine identity, I think we'd have an amazing church movement. If we could get our young men to stand up for the poor and, stand up in service, those are the things that, we would love to see. And just for the record, we see evidence of that every week in church. And this is not just a kind of bleak tale, because
all is not lost.
There'll be thousands of people listening who are like, yeah, we're doing that. Yes, we're mentoring our young men and boys. Yes, we're passionate about this conversation, I'm sure. But in a sort of in generalized overview, this is a conversation that we really need to have. But I want to thank you for the opportunity to stumble my way through this podcast. You've been far more elegant than I have, and far more sort of defined. And, I appreciate you suffering me as I've been sort of trying to work this stuff out and string together some coherence. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a work in progress, isn't it? And I want to end with sort of signposting for people who are thinking, what resources have I got? Maybe I'll preach on those difficult passages. Deep breath in. How can I resource myself? How can I resource my church to engage in this issue? And there might be people who are like, I don't have that many young people in my church. This is a great issue. I'll pray into it. But I don't think having less young people or children in your church is a cop-out here. I think it affects men of all ages. And also speaking to it and preaching to it gives Christian men who agree with this words and gives them confidence to speak out in these other conversations. So there is some resources available from an organisation called Restored UK. Their website is restoreduk.org. They've got a Bible study called First Man Standing, which is free to download, and that's 6 sessions equipping men to stand up and be counted and to express positive masculinity and protect women from violence. And they've also got some teaching resources for churches to grapple with some of those awkward scriptures so that you don't feel completely adrift and not knowing where to start. There's some prayers on there that you can download to use in your church. Have you got resources that you would signpost people to, Will?
I'm nervous always about some of the resources, just on the basis of the fact that I don't want to reinforce, again, a hegemonic masculine view. And I don't hold criticism out there for some of the resources, but again, I would encourage people, don't take my reference as an endorsement. I have done some work over the years with CVM, Christian Vision for Men, which is an organisation within the church that gathers men together and has been a supportive space for men to support one another. I have also done some work over the years, and I'm friends with James Ray, who runs XCC, Extreme Character Challenge, and takes groups of men up into the Highlands of Scotland or the wilds of Wales for an extreme character challenge. And they are brilliant on challenging addictions of particularly, we talked about pornography addiction today, helping men kind of encourage one another and to have real honest conversations about themselves and what's going on inside. So there are 2 that I would reference here. And I think in terms of biblical understanding, again, I'd encourage, I really enjoy the work of Morna Hooker, a feminist theologian, but I would encourage people to read widely. I think sometimes some of the books that I've accessed around maleness and scripture have tended to offer a very, very black and white view of some of the scriptures that you've referenced. And I think it's really important to dig into those scriptures and understand them in context and seek new views. I love the work of Isabella Hamley. She's a good friend. She's written some brilliant stuff from a feminist perspective, and Joanna Collicott as well, who is another friend and a fantastic writer. So if you're a guy and you're looking for a female theologian, you could dig into either of those and you'll find some amazing stuff. So there's a few ideas. Yeah.
Thanks. That's really helpful. I think this is, as we say, this isn't the conversation to end them all. This is the opening and the beginning, and there's so much more to dig into this. And I hope it's a part of our identity and it's something that we're going to grapple with. And it evolves because culture evolves. So it's always an ongoing conversation. And I'm sure there'll be things that pop up in the news, pop up in our social media feeds that make us go, wow, okay, how do we respond to that? Jesus, what's your response? Church, as a church leader, how can we address this? And I just want to pray for courage for church leaders to address these issues because they really matter, because they matter individually and because they matter relationally. And as we've seen from the statistics, they impact huge swathes of our society, quite often negatively, if we're not addressing it and making a stand. It's really, really important for the church to get involved and not stay silent on this. And thank you for persevering with this, Will. Champion it in your circles. It's been good.
Thanks a lot.
No, it's been really good. Thanks for chatting. Will's article, Redeeming Masculinity, is out in Roots Worship Together, issue 138, both in print and online. If you are thinking to provoke more discussion around this in your church, perhaps this topic of masculinity could be explored on Father's Day, honouring positive models of masculinity. If the statistics we shared about violence against women and girls appalled you, you can find out more about how your church can respond to domestic violence. I would recommend Restored UK. Their website is restored-uk.org. You could also look at marking White Ribbon Day in November. For RCL followers, the readings on Christ the King Day, which falls around the same time, lead us to examine power and how we use it. This might be a place to bring some teaching on these much neglected subjects. Roots produce weekly and seasonal materials to help you lead great church. Alongside our weekly preaching notes, prayers, intercessions, and intergenerational outlines for worship and communion services, we offer weekly commentary on the news and cultural events with ideas of how these topics connect to Scripture and the Sunday readings. Head to our website and look for The Week in Focus. You can explore all Roots has to offer with a free 4-week trial. Head to rootsforchurches.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with a friend and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Together, we can grow.